and I'm going to let Patrick and his slides, who's going to talk to us about what we do once you've submitted the data, his kind of insights from having gone through the data for the last few years, and what we do with the scorecards, what they contain, and how we use them. So I'll hand over to you, Patrick.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick. I'm the data analyst at Foundations. Been working on Delta data now since 2021-22 when I joined as an apprentice, and like to think I've sort of improved some of the reporting that we do on Delta since I joined. So work on Delta sort of from the early stages of doing things like the the Delta questions guidance document, all the way through to sort of the final analysis that appears on the website that I do for MHCLG, sort of behind the scenes, and also the scorecards, which have been happening for the last couple of years. So yeah, I'm aiming to just give you an idea of sort of what happens to your data once it's submitted, some of the common issues that I spot, and sort of how that then can sort of undermine some of the conclusions that we're trying to draw from the data. And then eventually I'll take you through an example scorecard from last year and show you how to interpret that if you have any issues with that at all. So what happens once your data is submitted? So it goes to MHCLG, to their Delta team, and Foundations receives periodic reports from them on the return rate, including those areas that haven't submitted yet. I can sort of identify them and inform regional advisors of the areas that haven't submitted yet, and let them know who they need to chase up. So the regional advisors send some sort of gentle reminders and offer any support to authorities that having issues submitting. And then once all authorities have submitted or given reasons to MHCLG as to why they haven't submitted it, they go on to close the survey. And then after that, MHCLG sort of shut the survey, send over a CSV file of the most recent year's data, which I then go on to analyse. So once the data gets to Foundations, I do data cleaning, so things like checking for duplicates, any sort of outliers, entry errors, null entries, things like that. So just removing some of the basic mistakes and errors. Do data validation, so I'll go through each field and make sure that the data in each of those questions is in the right format and correct, sort of sense check that. Then sort of load in secondary data from other sources, so Office of National Statistics, we use their data for things like population and tenure to try and see how well represented each age group and population group are within each authority, and sort of track the changes of that and the regional variances in that as well, on sort of county, local authority and regional level. And then data transformation, so creating additional fields and formulas that are going to feed into any analysis that I do. So and then merging the data, the most recent data, with the pre-existing database that contains all the Delta data spanning back to 2009 and 2010. So it goes back quite a way now. We've got a pretty good data set going back over 15 years, so we can really analyse trends and across a number of things. So I'm just going to talk about some of the common issues with the data, some of the more historical issues that we've had and how we've improved. We've sort of overcome those, and then a more sort of recent issue that I think could be remedied quite easily. So one of the more historical issues was the incomplete returns. So we had quite a low response rate up until 2016-17. So you can see there's quite a noted decrease in the percentage of authorities who are completing Delta. Sort of went down to about 70%. The year after that, I think prior to that, it was called LOGOSnet. Some of you might remember that. And then there was a sort of transition year of 2017-18 where there was no data collected at all. And then 2018-19, the Delta service was launched. Foundations then started getting involved with collecting the data and assisting with that. And since then, we've had sort of around 95% or above in the last 5 years. So really good return rate. And just to show you what impact that has, or what the historical lower return rate has on our analysis. So the purple line shows the reported number of completions, so that's the total number of DFG completions that were reported in Delta, and the sort of turquoise line above that shows you the estimated number of completions. So you can see that as the years in which the return rate was lower, so remember it was 2016-17, where that was at its lowest ebb, there is a big gap in between the reported completions and the estimated completions. So essentially what I did was a regression analysis. I looked at the secondary data that was available, saw what correlated most strongly with the number of DFG completions, and it was allocation. So I've looked at the allocation in all those areas that didn't complete Delta in each year, and then multiplied that by the regional completions per pound of allocation, and then added that to the reported number. But the point I was trying to illustrate really is that you can see in the years where we've had really high amounts of completion of returns, there isn't much of a discrepancy between the estimates and the reported, because we've got such a representative data set. But just when we've got incomplete data, we really are making assumptions, and then any sort of analysis or conclusions that we're trying to draw are less valid, and really impact on any sort of policy decisions that are wanting to be made, or even just sort of internal, more local analysis that you're trying to do too. So moving on to another issue is inconsistent answers, or inconsistent values. So one of the things that we keep spotting is that we have a series of questions in Delta where in an ideal world the totals would all match up. So as Paul was sort of going through the questions earlier, we asked the DFGs by different types of tenure, so owner occupiers, private rented sector, and social housing, and then different age groups, so children, working age, state pensionable age, and then the different grant value bands too, as well as just asking straight up how many DFGs did you complete last year. So if we looked at those totals for 2023-24, added up across all authorities, these are the totals that we had. So you can see that if we look at the values, there's a discrepancy of around 10,000 between the total DFGs completed by each value and those in tenure. And it kind of makes sense where you've got fewer values in those overall, because as some people were mentioning before, you might not be able to report on certain tenures or certain age groups. You don't have a complete data set, or you've transitioned from one system to another, so you're just adding in what you can. But it is quite common for, I think around 40% of authorities had discrepancies in these figures last year, where they're reporting sort of vastly different totals by tenure, age, value, and overall. And it just makes it quite difficult to come up with what the actual true total number of completions is in an authority, particularly when you're trying to look at the different demographic splits of where DFGs are going, and then you're given these figures and they're not being consistent. So just spending that extra few minutes just making sure that your figures are as close as possible across these values will go a long way to kind of improving data quality and overall just having a positive impact on the analysis that you receive in the end. So I'm going to go on to the scorecards now, and I think the scorecards were an initiative that came in last year. I did it initially as my project, so an apprenticeship that I was completing last year. It was Paul's idea, and I think they've been pretty useful. And I think not only are we trying to give you something that you can use at your authority to give you a better idea of where you stand against the region and nationally, and make you just appreciate that some authorities work can be quite siloed, and just trying to give you a broader context of where you stand in relation to those around you. But one of the main or sort of secondary things we're hoping to achieve with this is really improve the data quality of the analysis too, the data quality of the Delta data, because I think prior to something like this, if you're not receiving many insights back from the data you're giving out, it quickly can become a sort of box ticking exercise. So yeah, hopefully you've had some benefit from these. And if you haven't received your scorecard, as Paul said, just please email foundations at info@foundations.uk.com or the Delta one too. So I'm just going to go through each section of this example scorecard. So it's an anonymized scorecard, and just give you an idea of what's contained on there and how to interpret it and what each of these measures means. So I've anonymized some of the fields, so I've removed the allocation in case there's anybody particularly really trying to find out which authority this is, but it's just a completely randomly selected one. So it shows you the DFGs completed in 2023-24, and the bracketed value is just showing you the yearly change. So this authority, local authority 6, is quite similar to the year before. They've only had an increase of 8 DFGs from the prior year, and an average value of 7,390. That value is just calculated. It's not asked because we don't ask for expenditure, although they have done in 24-25. That was just used by dividing the DFG, the allocation by the numbers completed. So it's assuming 100% expenditure of your DFG allocation on the DFGs that you've reported as completing in this. And then there's DFGs by age group. So we're showing the distribution across different age groups. So, and again, the values at the bottom show you the change on the year before. So this particular authority had an increase in grants for 66 and plus year olds, and a decrease in the other two age groups. And you can see that's reflected in the pie chart. They actually do more grants, a higher proportion of their grants go to 66 plus year olds than both the region and nationally. So if we move on to, this is probably the part of the scorecard that generates the most conversation queries. So these are delivery times. So it shows you delivery based on the number of working days for your application, so stage 2, approval of your application, stage 3, and then on-site, which is practical completion, so from approval to practical completion. The green bar shows you your authority, or in this case, local authority 6. The blue, the region, so you can see this region's better than, or faster rather than the national average, and then it shows you the national average in the sort of maroon claret, and the changes are all reflected in the bracketed values again. The sort of bell curve you can see, or the distribution curve you can see in the top right, that's showing you the distribution of delivery times across England last year based on Delta data, so for stages 2 to 4. It only includes authorities that have completed data for all 3 stages that we've asked for. So if your authority, you might have a scorecard and you've only submitted data for 2 of the stages, you won't see this bell curve in your scorecard because it's not a full data set. So we're only looking at those areas that submitted full returns on that. And the vertical line, so there's a little 5 next to it, those small numbers refer to there's FAQs included in the PDF that you will have received or will receive that explain each of these. But that vertical line represents, in this case, local authority 6, and it's that x-axis is delivery time. So further you are to the left, the faster you've delivered the DFG on average. So you can see that they are actually in the fastest 7% of local authorities for delivery time. So, you know, one of the faster delivering authorities. So, and if you've completed all 3 stages, you will you'll get that insight as well on your scorecard. So finally, moving on to the DFGs by tenure. This authority is quite similar to, so this is a similar format to the age portion of the scorecard, where you've got owner occupiers represented by the green wedge, housing association and registered provider tenants by blue, private rented by the small claret, and then orange is caravan and houseboats. So you can see this authority had more caravan and houseboat grants completed than the region and nation proportionally. So, but other than that, quite a similar sort of split. Maybe fewer for private rented here than in other other areas, but more similar to the norm in that case. So just final thoughts from me. I think your data helps build a national picture, and the scorecards really do only make a small part of the analysis. There's last year there was a lot more sort of priority analysis requested by MHCLG, so a lot of extra stuff that wanted to be done as a matter of urgency. And I think you can see the appetite that the new government have in using data by the fact that they're bringing the return forwards by about 6 months this year. So there's a real interest in using that data, and just sort of the better the data quality submitted by yourselves, the sort of fewer assumptions that need to be made in the analysis and sort of logical leaps, which have knock-on impacts on conclusions that are made on a national level and local level. So quite a few authorities have asked for, receive scorecards and then just asked for the data to be changed because they've realised what they've submitted in the Delta data doesn't reflect their internal records. So I think it's making people consider their data quality a bit more because they're actually getting something back from these scorecards. So yeah, just spending that extra bit of time just sort of on your end with the data quality would really help. Well, not just myself, but also anybody that's trying to use the data, for the scorecards or be it in sort of national policy discussions. So yeah, if you've got any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to deal with any.
Great, thank you, Patrick. We've had a few other questions coming, so I'll just saved a few of them. So Andrew was asking about last year's Delta asked for 5 grants over 30k, and info as of how they were funded. So Andrew, as you're hopefully aware, there's been an ongoing review of the upper limit that I think I mentioned earlier. The results of that will be part of the spending review next month. So that's why those 5 questions in particular were asked last year. So I think kind of this question that you've asked, Alistair, also links into kind of this question from Julie. And I think kind of what you need to think about is that I suppose the Delta return is really asking about, for the most part, how you spent the DFG allocation that you received from the government and things around that. It's not about kind of DFGs as they're set out in the legislation. They both have the same 3 letters attached to them, DFG, which is perhaps if the funding was called something different to the grant, that might be a little bit helpful. But in terms of thinking about your Delta return, the government's really interested in how you spend the money that you get each year that has the badge DFG associated with it. We've got, and I think this kind of goes back to what I said at the start, Chris, and what Patrick just said. The questions have been quite consistent for the last 4 or 5 years, and this year additional questions have been asked because there are things happening like the review of the upper limit and the review of the allocations formula. So that's why the additional questions have been asked. And obviously this time last year, the government they're in now weren't in at this time last year, which is why I think kind of why the questions have changed. How much has the average DFG value increased year on year? I mean, that one's slightly difficult to answer, Russ. I'll hand over to Patrick in a moment to give you an estimate. But because in previous years the amount spent hasn't been asked, it's always been a bit more of a kind of a guesstimate in terms of what the average DFG value actually was. But Patrick has done some analysis of that. So what would you, how would you kind of term the increase, Patrick?
So longer term, the average value that we saw sort of at the start, using the method of just assuming that all of the allocation was spent, it was around 4,000 in about 2011, 2012, whereas last year it was over 10,000, so it was £10,350. And I think it's quite difficult to track over the immediate term, well, the last 3 or 4 years because of COVID. There was a massive decrease in DFGs completed. And we, not all of that. If we're using that method, it shows a massive spike in the value of the average DFG, whereas, that's just a limitation of the method where we've had to just make an assumption that all the allocation was spent on DFG, whereas actually it was just a decrease in activity in adaptations rather than an increase in complexity because of COVID. So, but over the past 5 years, since 2016-17, it was just under 9,000. Now it's just below 10,500. So, yeah, it's increased in about, probably in line with inflation, really.
Yeah, but I think this year, well, obviously knowing exactly what has been spent, we'll have a much more accurate picture, won't we? So Callie's asked about how useful the averages are when the extremes of spend and grant levels are so wide. I suppose that's why averages are really helpful, particularly on the timescales. I think they've been certainly the regional advisors that used them in discussions with local authorities. They found them really, really valuable. In terms of accessing the scorecards, if you work for a county or part of the BCF team for previous years, you need to ask your district councils to pass them on to you. And if this year they tick the box to say they're happy for them to be shared, then we can send them to you later in the year. But for previous years, you'd speak to your your district council colleagues. And Robert's asked why there isn't a stage 1 inquiry received from service user to recommendations submitted to LA. I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that, Robert. One is that I think district councils would find that particularly difficult to report on if that particular stage is almost certainly carried out at the county level. So that'd be really difficult. And I think the other bit of stage 1 is that it's not necessarily always the case that somebody enters social care, knows that they need a stair lift, a ramp or a shower and goes straight to stair lift, ramp or shower. There may be other things that happen in between. It might be equipment, it may be other occupational therapy services, it might be other social services. So it's a lot less of a linear path through stage 1 to get to that kind of agreed point of assessment. So it's both in terms of it being potentially a bit of a messy process and it not being captured potentially by very many of the local authorities involved. So if we had any other questions since, let's have a look. Practically, that's obviously good for local systems, but because probably a good deal of local authorities wouldn't, it hasn't been asked for as part of this collection. And certainly, if you're recording it locally, Simon, I'm sure you'd find that very, very valuable. Mike, in terms of the scorecards, we were trying to come up with something that was meaningful and that had some data that went back a few years for comparison. So it kind of picks out hopefully the bits that are most useful to you. If there's other elements that you would think may be useful, then we may be able to kind of improve the scorecard going forward. Certainly, I think this year's scorecard is an improvement on last year's, and I'm sure next year's will be as well. So if there's kind of particular data that you would find useful, please do let us know. And yeah, we'll hopefully find out on the 11th of June what will happen to the upper limit, which is also my birthday, so it'll be an exciting day. Yeah. So Claire, that's an interesting one because it's wonder if or how you certify that as capital spend. So it'll be interesting to perhaps drop us a line at datareturns@foundations.uk.com to discuss that one. So Delta submission is now open. It closes, it's around the middle of June. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. I don't know if you got it to hand, Patrick, but I think it's around the middle of June, isn't it? I'm sure it's the middle of June. But thank you all for the questions, and thank you, Patrick, for joining us this afternoon. Really helpful. Thank you.